Deep in the hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the fog clings to the mountains like a shroud and the creeks run dark with coal dust, there existed a family whose bloodline had twisted back upon itself so many times that nature itself seemed to rebel against their existence. This is the story of Jacob Hutchins, a boy born into a web of forbidden unions so tangled that his very DNA was a map of genetic catastrophe. A child whose body fought against itself from the moment he drew his first breath in 1957, in a decaying cabin beside what locals whispered was the Rotten River. The Appalachian Mountains have always harbored secrets, remote valleys where families lived for generations without outside contact, where the nearest neighbor might be miles away through treacherous terrain, where the old ways persisted long after the rest of America had moved on. But even among these isolated communities, the Hutchins family stood apart. They had lived in the same narrow hollow for over 150 years, a place so remote that it appeared on no official maps, accessible only by a rutted dirt path that became impassable during the winter months. The year was 1957, and the world beyond the mountains was transforming. Elvis Presley dominated the radio waves, and families across America gathered around television sets to watch I Love Lucy. But in Dead Man's Hollow, Kentucky, time moved differently. The Hutchins family had no electricity, no running water, and certainly no connection to the rapidly modernizing world beyond their mountain prison. Sarah Hutchins went into labor on a February morning when the temperature had plunged to 15 degrees below zero. The cabin, constructed from rough-hewn logs by her great-great-grandfather in the 1820s, offered little protection from the biting wind that howled through the gaps in the walls. Her mother, Martha, who was also her aunt, attended the birth. This dual relationship was not unusual in the Hutchins family. It was, in fact, the norm. The family tree of the Hutchins clan resembled less a tree and more a tightly wound rope, with the same names appearing over and over again in multiple positions. Sarah's father was also her uncle. Her husband, William, was her second cousin, but also related to her through two other lines of descent. For 5 generations, the Hutchins family had married exclusively within their own bloodline, not out of preference, but out of isolation and a deeply ingrained distrust of outsiders. When Jacob finally emerged after 18 hours of agonizing labor, the midwife, an elderly woman named Prudence, who was simultaneously Sarah's grandmother and great-aunt, knew immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. The infant's skull was misshapen, elongated in a way that suggested the bones had failed to properly fuse. His left eye sat noticeably higher than his right, and his mouth twisted at an unnatural angle. His skin had a translucent quality, revealing a network of blue veins beneath, like a map of rivers drawn on parchment. But it was his breathing that terrified them most. Each breath came with a wet, rattling sound, as though his lungs were filled with water. His tiny chest heaved with the effort of drawing air, and his lips had already taken on a bluish tinge. Prudence had delivered 43 babies in her 72 years, and she had never seen a child struggle so desperately just to survive his first hour. William Hutchins stood in the corner of the room, his own face bearing the subtle markers of generations of intermarriage, eyes set too close together, a severely receding chin, and hands with fingers that bent at odd angles. He was 34 years old, but looked 50, his body already worn down by the harsh life in the hollow and the genetic burden he carried. He stared at his newborn son with a mixture of horror and resignation. "He ain't gonna make it through the night," Prudence said quietly, wrapping the struggling infant in a threadbare blanket. "His insides ain't right. I can feel it." But Jacob did survive that night, and the next, and the one after that. Against all odds and expectations, the child who should have died in his first hours clung to life with a tenacity that seemed almost supernatural. Yet survival, in Jacob's case, was not the same as living. By the time he was 6 months old, it became clear that Jacob's problems extended far beyond his physical deformities. He could not hold his head up. His eyes did not track movement. When other babies his age were beginning to babble and explore their surroundings, Jacob lay motionless, his breathing still labored, his body unresponsive to stimulation. The local doctor, who made rare visits to the remote hollow, examined the boy and delivered a grim diagnosis. "This child has the development of a newborn," he told Sarah and William in the spring of 1958. "His brain isn't growing properly. His organs are failing to develop as they should. I've seen cases like this before, always in families that—" He paused, choosing his words carefully, "in families that have kept to themselves for too long." The doctor explained what he knew about genetics, about how when close relatives have children together, recessive genes double up, expressing themselves in ways that nature had designed to remain hidden. He spoke of hemophilia in European royal families, of the Habsburg jaw that had become so pronounced in the Spanish line that the last Habsburg king couldn't even chew his own food. But the Hutchins family had taken it further than any royal dynasty. They had compressed their gene pool to the point of collapse. "Every time close family members have a child," the doctor continued, "they're essentially rolling dice with loaded odds, and you've been rolling those dice for generations. This boy is paying the price for choices made long before he was born. Confira si già è inscritto neste canal to witness the darkest secrets of bloodlines that should never have existed. Stories so disturbing they've been buried in medical records and family graves for generations." As Jacob grew, or rather, as his body aged without truly developing, the full extent of his genetic catastrophe became apparent. At 1 year old, he weighed only 11 pounds, the size of a 3-month-old infant. His bones were brittle, breaking from the slightest pressure. His skin remained thin and translucent, tearing easily and healing slowly. But most heartbreaking of all, his mind remained trapped in an eternal infancy. The family tried to care for him as best they could. Sarah spent her days trying to get him to take nourishment, spooning thin gruel into his twisted mouth, most of it dribbling back out. She sang to him the old mountain songs her mother had taught her, ballads brought over from Scotland and Ireland 2 centuries ago, their melodies unchanged by time. But Jacob never responded. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, seeing nothing, understanding nothing. The other children in the hollow, and there were many, learned to avoid the Hutchins cabin. They whispered stories about the demon baby who never grew, who couldn't die but couldn't live. These children, nearly all of them products of cousin marriages themselves, bore their own marks: club feet, cleft palates, missing fingers, hearing loss. But Jacob represented something worse, a glimpse into the abyss of genetic collapse. By his 2nd birthday, Jacob had developed seizures. They would come without warning, his small body going rigid, his eyes rolling back in his head, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. Each seizure seemed to take something more from him, leaving him weaker, more fragile. The doctor, on one of his increasingly rare visits, could offer no treatment. There were no medications that could help, no procedures that could repair the fundamental brokenness of Jacob's genetic code. "His chromosomes are damaged," the doctor explained to Sarah, though he knew she couldn't fully understand the science. "It's like building a house with a blueprint that's been copied so many times the instructions don't make sense anymore. Nothing lines up right. Nothing works the way it should." The winter of 1959 brought the worst cold snap in 50 years. Snow buried the cabin up to the windows, and ice formed on the inside walls. The family huddled around the small wood stove, burning everything they could find to stay warm. Jacob, now nearly 3 years old but still the size of an infant, struggled more than ever to breathe in the cold air. His lips turned purple and his fingernails became black from lack of oxygen. Sarah held him constantly during those frozen months, her own body the only source of warmth that seemed to help. She whispered prayers learned from her grandmother, old petitions to a God who seemed to have abandoned Deadman's Hollow long ago. William worked from dawn until dark, chopping wood, trying to keep them all alive, but even he had to admit that each day Jacob survived was both a miracle and a curse. To understand Jacob's tragedy, one must understand the history of the Hutchins family and how they came to be trapped in their hollow. The story begins in 1803, when Ezekiel Hutchins, a Scottish immigrant, received a land grant for 200 acres in what would become eastern Kentucky. Ezekiel brought with him his wife and their 6 children, settling in a remote valley that seemed like paradise after the hardships of their Atlantic crossing. For the first 2 generations, the Hutchins family thrived. They farmed the fertile bottomland, hunted the abundant game, and lived in relative prosperity. But Ezekiel had instilled in his children a deep suspicion of outsiders, a belief that family loyalty was the highest virtue, and that the outside world was full of dangers and corruptions. When his children came of age, he encouraged them to marry within the extended family network, to keep the land undivided and the bloodline pure. The first cousin marriages in the family seemed harmless. The children appeared healthy, the farms remained productive, and the family grew. But with each generation, the pool of potential marriage partners shrank. By the 1850s, the Hutchins family had become so isolated, both by choice and by geography, that young people had virtually no contact with anyone outside their own clan. The Civil War devastated the region. Kentucky, a border state torn between North and South, saw some of the war's most brutal fighting. The Hutchins family, suspicious of both sides, retreated deeper into their hollow, avoiding conscription by hiding in the caves that riddled the mountainside. When the war ended, they found themselves even more cut off from the outside world. The old wagon roads had been destroyed. The nearby towns lay in ruins, and the family had no desire to rebuild connections with a world that had brought such destruction. It was during the 1870s that the pattern of uncle-niece and cousin marriages became fully established in the family. Joshua Hutchins married his brother's daughter. Their son married his own cousin, who was also the daughter of his mother's sister. The family tree began to loop back on itself, creating what geneticists would later call a genetic bottleneck of catastrophic proportions. By 1900, every member of the Hutchins family was related to every other member through multiple lines of descent. A child might count the same ancestor appearing 8 or 10 times in different positions on their family tree. The effects began to show. Infant mortality rates climbed. Children were born with increasingly severe deformities. The family's average lifespan dropped from the mid-60s to the mid-40s. But the family's isolation and their deeply ingrained beliefs made change impossible. They saw their problems not as the result of their marriage practices, but as God's will, as tests of faith, as the price of living apart from the corrupted world. When outsiders occasionally ventured into the hollow, the Hutchins family drove them away with threats and, when necessary, violence. They wanted no interference, no questions, no judgment. Sarah's own childhood had been marked by loss. Of the 8 children her mother bore, only 3 survived past the age of 5. 2 were born without the ability to swallow and starved to death in their first weeks. One had a heart that formed outside his chest and lived only 3 days. Another seemed healthy, but died suddenly at 18 months from what the family could only assume was some invisible internal defect. Sarah herself suffered from severe joint problems that made walking painful and from a curvature of the spine that had grown worse with each pregnancy. She had given birth to Jacob when she was just 19 years old. It was her 3rd pregnancy. The first had ended in a stillbirth at 7 months, the infant's head grotesquely enlarged with fluid. The second child, a girl, had lived for 6 weeks before dying in her sleep, her tiny heart simply stopping for no apparent reason. Jacob was her third attempt at motherhood, and his survival, however limited, was the closest she had come to success. William's family history was even darker. His father had married his own niece, and William was the only one of their 7 children to survive to adulthood. His siblings had died from a horrifying array of genetic disorders, one from kidneys that never properly developed, another from a form of muscular dystrophy that left him unable to breathe, a third from seizures that grew progressively worse until they killed him at age 12. William himself suffered from chronic digestive problems, severe allergies, and a degenerative condition that was slowly destroying his vision. When William and Sarah married in 1955, both families knew the risks. But in Dead Man's Hollow, there were no other options. The 3 other families that still lived in the area were all related to the Hutchins through previous marriages. Every potential spouse was a cousin of some degree. The choice wasn't whether to marry within the family, but rather which family member to marry. Dr. Robert Chen, a geneticist from the University of Kentucky, first heard about the Hutchins family in 1962. A colleague had mentioned the existence of an isolated community in the eastern mountains where genetic disorders seemed unusually common. Intrigued, Dr. Chen decided to investigate, hoping to study what he suspected might be a rare case of extreme genetic drift. What he found in Dead Man's Hollow shocked him. In his 20 years of studying human genetics, including work with isolated populations in Iceland and remote Pacific islands, Dr. Chen had never encountered a family with such a concentrated and severe genetic burden. After examining Jacob and several other family members, he estimated that the coefficient of inbreeding in the Hutchins family approached levels never before documented in a human population. In normal human populations, Dr. Chen later wrote in his research notes, the coefficient of inbreeding is close to 0. Even in first-cousin marriages, it only reaches 0.0625. But in the Hutchins family, I calculated a coefficient approaching 0.5, meaning that roughly half of all their genes were identical by descent. To put this in perspective, this level of inbreeding is higher than that found in laboratory mouse strains specifically bred for genetic uniformity. Dr. Chen explained to Sarah and William what this meant in practical terms. Every human carries 2 copies of each gene, one from their mother and one from their father. In a normal, genetically diverse population, if one copy of a gene is defective, the other copy can often compensate. But when close relatives have children, there's an increased chance that both parents carry the same defective gene and that their child will inherit 2 broken copies. With Jacob, Dr. Chen explained gently, he's inherited 2 defective copies of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of genes. His body is trying to build itself using broken instructions. Some of these defects affect his brain development, others affect his bones, his organs, his immune system. It's not any single genetic disorder. It's a cascade of problems, each one compounding the others. The doctor showed them diagrams, trying to make them understand how each generation of cousin marriage had increased the risk, how the family's isolation had trapped them in a genetic death spiral. He spoke of hemoglobin disorders, of enzyme deficiencies, of problems with the way Jacob's cells produced energy. He explained that Jacob's seizures were likely caused by abnormal brain structure, that his breathing difficulties stemmed from malformed lungs, that his failure to grow resulted from a pituitary gland that couldn't produce the necessary hormones. In a more diverse population, Dr. Chen said, these genes would be rare, scattered, unlikely to meet. But in your family, they've become concentrated, common, inevitable. At this point in the video, Sarah looked directly at the camera, her eyes hollow with grief, and whispered something that would haunt Dr. Chen for the rest of his life. We loved each other, but our love created monsters. If you're watching this and these words struck your heart, leave them in the comments below. Let the world know that this story reached you, that these forgotten victims aren't forgotten anymore. By the time Jacob reached his 5th birthday in 1962, his condition had deteriorated further. He weighed only 19 pounds, about the size of a 6-month-old baby. His bones had become so brittle that Sarah could no longer hold him without risking fractures. His skin, thin as tissue paper, tore at the slightest friction, leaving open wounds that refused to heal. His seizures had increased in frequency and intensity, sometimes lasting for hours, leaving him unconscious and barely breathing. But perhaps most tragic of all, Jacob had begun to experience moments of what appeared to be awareness. His eyes, which had stared blankly for so long, would occasionally focus on his mother's face. Sometimes, a sound that might have been an attempt at vocalization would escape his twisted mouth. These moments gave Sarah hope that her son might somehow, against all odds, begin to develop. But Dr. Chen had to deliver a crushing truth. "These aren't signs of improvement," he told her. "Jacob's brain is dying. As neurons die, sometimes they fire randomly, creating the illusion of awareness. I'm sorry, but what you're seeing aren't signs that he's waking up. They're signs that he's fading away." The other children born into the Hutchins family during this period fared little better. Between 1958 and 1963, 12 babies were born in Dead Man's Hollow. Only 3 survived past their 1st birthday. Of those 3, 2 had severe intellectual disabilities and physical deformities. The 3rd, a girl named Mary, appeared relatively healthy, but would later be discovered to have a heart condition that would kill her at age 14. Dr. Chen documented all of this in his research, creating a medical record of genetic catastrophe. He photographed the children with the family's permission, creating a visual archive that would later be used in genetics textbooks as an example of extreme inbreeding depression. He collected blood samples, measured heads and limbs, recorded developmental milestones or the lack thereof. His research would eventually contribute to laws in several states prohibiting marriages between close relatives. But for the Hutchins family, this knowledge came too late. The damage had been done over 5 generations. Even if they stopped marrying within the family immediately, the genetic load they carried would affect their descendants for generations to come. Dr. Chen tried to explain this to them, tried to convince them to allow their children to marry outside the family, to seek partners from other communities, but the old beliefs ran deep. "The outside world is wicked," William told him. "Our family has stayed pure, stayed true. These afflictions are trials from God, testing our faith." Dr. Chen wanted to scream at him, to make him understand that these weren't trials from God, but the inevitable result of violating fundamental biological laws. But he remained calm, professional, hoping that patience and education might eventually break through the wall of superstition and ignorance. The winter of 1963 brought another brutal cold snap to eastern Kentucky. Snow fell for 3 straight days, burying the cabin and making travel impossible. Inside, the Hutchins family burned their furniture for warmth, having run out of firewood. Jacob, now nearly 6 years old, but still trapped in an infant's body, lay in his mother's arms, struggling with each breath. His seizures had become almost constant. Sometimes his small body would convulse for hours, his muscles contracting so violently that Sarah could hear his bones cracking. Other times, he would lie perfectly still, barely breathing, his pulse so weak that she had to hold her hand over his mouth to feel the faint warmth that proved he was still alive. Dr. Chen had visited just before the snow began, bringing medicines that he hoped might ease Jacob's suffering. Phenobarbital for the seizures, morphine for pain, oxygen tanks that might help his labored breathing. But the medicines seemed to have little effect. Jacob's body, so profoundly broken, couldn't process drugs the way a normal body would. "I don't think he can survive much longer," Dr. Chen had told Sarah honestly. "His organs are failing, his heart is giving out." "I'm surprised he's lasted this long." Sarah had nodded, tears streaming down her face. She had known for years that Jacob would never grow up, would never speak, would never know her as his mother, but knowing that his suffering would soon end brought not relief, but a grief so profound it felt like drowning. On the night of January 17th, 1964, Jacob's breathing changed. The rattling sound that had accompanied every breath for nearly 6 years became quieter, shallower. His lips, always tinged with blue, turned nearly purple. Sarah held him close, singing the old mountain ballads one last time, her voice cracking with emotion. William sat beside them, his own health failing, his body worn down by the same genetic burden that had destroyed his son. Around them, the rest of the family gathered. Sarah's mother, Martha, who was also her aunt, her father, John, who was also her uncle, William's sister, Elizabeth, who was also his cousin, and several other relatives, all of them connected through multiple lines of descent, all of them bearing the marks of generations of intermarriage. They prayed together, reciting verses from the old family Bible, asking God to take Jacob home, to end his suffering, to grant him the peace that life had never offered. And as the night deepened and the temperature dropped, Jacob Hutchins took his last breath. His small chest rose one final time, held for a moment, and then fell still. He was 6 years and 11 months old. He weighed 21 pounds. He had never spoken, never walked, never truly been conscious of the world around him. His entire life had been a battle against a body that couldn't function, a mind that couldn't develop, a genetic legacy that had doomed him before he was even conceived. Dr. Chen performed an autopsy with the family's permission, hoping to document the full extent of Jacob's genetic disorders for medical science. What he found was even worse than he had imagined. Jacob's brain had never developed beyond that of a newborn. His heart had 3 chambers instead of 4. His lungs were filled with scar tissue from constant infections. His liver and kidneys showed signs of failure. His bones were riddled with fractures in various stages of healing. His chromosomes, when analyzed, showed abnormalities on multiple pairs, deletions and duplications that had resulted from the extreme inbreeding. "This child," Dr. Chen wrote in his report, "represents one of the most severe cases of inbreeding depression ever documented in humans. Every system in his body was compromised by his genetic inheritance. That he survived nearly 7 years is testament not to the strength of his constitution, but to the tenacity of human life itself, its stubborn refusal to surrender even when every biological factor argues for death." The Hutchins family buried Jacob on a hillside overlooking the hollow, in a cemetery where generations of their family lay. The markers, many of them simple stones with dates carved by hand, told the story of infant mortality and early death. Of the 47 graves in the family cemetery, 31 belonged to children who had died before their 10th birthday. After Jacob's death, Dr. Chen redoubled his efforts to convince the remaining Hutchins family members to marry outside their bloodline. He brought in social workers, genetic counselors, ministers from mainstream churches who tried to explain that God's will didn't include the suffering of innocent children born into genetic catastrophe. Slowly, painfully, some family members began to listen. In the years following Jacob's death, the Hutchins family began to change. The younger generation, exposed to the outside world through Dr. Chen's visits and the social workers who followed him, started to question the old ways. Several young people left the hollow entirely, moving to nearby towns, marrying outside the family, breaking the cycle that had trapped their ancestors for 5 generations. But change came too slowly for many. Between 1964 and 1975, 8 more children were born into the close-knit family structure that remained in Deadman's Hollow. 6 of them died in infancy. The 2 who survived both had severe disabilities that would affect them for their entire lives. Sarah never had another child after Jacob. The trauma of watching her son suffer and die broke something fundamental in her. She lived until 1982, dying at the age of 44 from complications related to the genetic disorders she carried. William survived her by only 3 years, his failing vision and deteriorating health finally claiming him in 1985. Dr. Chen continued to study the Hutchins family and other isolated Appalachian communities for the rest of his career. His research contributed to a broader understanding of genetic disorders and the dangers of consanguinity. He advocated for genetic counseling services in rural areas, for education about the risks of cousin marriage, for social programs that could help isolated communities connect with the broader world. In his final paper on the subject, published in 1989, Dr. Chen wrote, "The tragedy of families like the Hutchins is not that they were evil or deliberately cruel, it's that they were isolated, both geographically and culturally, to the point where their natural desire to preserve family unity led them down a path of genetic destruction." Jacob Hutchins was not the victim of malice, but of ignorance, isolation, and the unforgiving mathematics of genetic inheritance. Today, Deadman's Hollow is abandoned. The last residents left in 1994, moving to nearby towns where their children could attend school and receive medical care. The cabin where Jacob was born and died still stands, though its roof has collapsed and its walls are slowly returning to the earth. The family cemetery remains, tended occasionally by descendants who now live scattered across Kentucky and beyond. Their family trees finally branching out, diversifying, healing. The rotten river, which gave the hollow its dark reputation, still flows through the valley, its water stained brown by coal runoff and natural tannins from the surrounding forest. Local people still avoid it, but now for environmental reasons rather than superstitious dread. The name has stuck, though, a reminder of the darkness that once dwelt in these mountains. Jacob's story became a case study in medical schools, his photographs appearing in genetics textbooks alongside explanations of inbreeding depression, genetic drift, and the importance of genetic diversity. Students learning about human genetics study his case, examining the family tree that looped back on itself so many times it barely resembled a tree at all. But beyond the medical significance, Jacob's story serves as a reminder of the human cost of isolation. In trying to preserve their family's purity, the Hutchins clan had created a genetic prison from which escape became increasingly impossible with each generation. Children like Jacob paid the ultimate price for decisions made by ancestors they would never know, trapped in bodies that couldn't function because their DNA had been copied and recopied from 2 similar sources until the errors became fatal. The few surviving descendants of the Hutchins family who agreed to be interviewed for this story spoke of the shame and trauma that still haunts them. They carry not just the physical markers of their family's history, the minor deformities and health problems that persist even after marrying outside the family, but also the psychological burden of knowing what their family tree represents. "I look at my own children," said Thomas Hutchins, Sarah's great-nephew, who married a woman from Ohio and now lives in Lexington, "and I'm grateful every day that they're healthy. Every milestone they reach, every normal thing they do, I think about Jacob and the others who never had a chance. We broke the cycle, but we can't forget what it cost." The broader Appalachian community has also struggled with the legacy of families like the Hutchins. For generations, the region has been stereotyped and stigmatized, its people portrayed as backwards and inbred. While cases like the Hutchins family did exist, they represented extreme outliers rather than the norm. Most Appalachian families maintained connections with the outside world, married within normal degrees of relationship, and raised healthy children. But the stereotype persisted, fueled by sensationalized accounts and the undeniable fact that geographic isolation in the mountains did sometimes lead to increased rates of cousin marriage and the genetic problems that came with it. Public health officials and educators in the region have worked for decades to combat both the practice and the stigma with considerable success. Today, genetic counseling is widely available in rural Kentucky. Programs exist to educate young people about the risks of consanguinity. Social services help connect isolated communities with the broader world. The rate of cousin marriage has dropped dramatically, and with it, the incidence of genetic disorders related to inbreeding. But Jacob Hutchins and the countless others like him who suffered and died in the isolated hollows of Appalachia should not be forgotten. Their stories, painful as they are, serve as powerful reminders of why genetic diversity matters, why isolation is dangerous, and why the desire to keep families pure leads only to suffering. In the end, Jacob lived for 6 years and 11 months. In that time, he never walked, never talked, never played, never experienced any of the joys that make childhood precious. He existed in a state of constant suffering, his body betraying him at every turn, his genetic inheritance a death sentence written in the twisted ladder of his DNA. He was the son of the Rotten River, a child who died a little more every day, not because of any fault of his own, but because generations before him had made choices that would echo through their bloodline like poison in a well. His grave marker, a simple stone carved with his name and dates, stands among the others in the family cemetery on the hillside. Wildflowers grow around it now, planted by a distant cousin who tends the cemetery once a year. The inscription reads simply, Jacob Hutchins, 1957-1964, may he find peace. And perhaps he has. Perhaps in death, Jacob finally escaped the genetic prison that held him captive in life. Perhaps his story, told now to audiences far beyond the isolated hollow where he lived and died, can prevent other families from making the same mistakes, can save other children from the same fate. If you've watched this entire story, if you've stayed with Jacob through his tragic journey, then you understand the importance of remembering these forgotten victims of genetic catastrophe. Leave a comment saying, I watched until here, so I can know you and recognize who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. These aren't just medical case studies or genetic curiosities. These are real people who suffered, real families who loved their children even as those children died in their arms, real tragedies that unfolded in the shadows of the American mountains while the rest of the world moved on, unaware and uncaring. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it helped you understand the importance of genetic diversity and the dangers of extreme isolation, then please like this video. Share it with others who need to understand that the choices we make about family and reproduction have consequences that ripple through generations. Subscribe to this channel to continue discovering the hidden stories of families whose secrets were buried in medical records and mountain cemeteries, stories that deserve to be told, remembered, and learned from. The Rotten River still flows through Dead Man's Hollow, carrying its dark waters down from the mountains. But the cabins are empty now. The voice is silent, the children gone. What remains is the memory, the warning, the lesson written in the short, tragic life of a boy who never had a chance, who died a little more with each breath he struggled to take, who paid the ultimate price for the sins of isolation and the mathematics of genetic inheritance. His story ends here, but its echoes will continue as long as we remember, as long as we learn, as long as we ensure that no other child suffers as Jacob Hutchins suffered in the hollow that time forgot.